Next in radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz, and the date is January 25th, 2016. More market turmoil. Looks like it's here, and where it stops, well, nobody knows. But the person who's been on top of this from the get-go is John Rubino of dollarcollapse.com. John, so interesting times, huh?
Hey, Kerry. Yeah, another brutal Monday. Stocks in the U.S. are down hard. Gold and silver are up. Oil's down like 4% right now. So the little pop that we had off the bottom of the last few days seems to be reversing out. And fear is back in charge. So it's risk off all around the world.
Risk off. Yeah, it's like, I don't know how you structure a portfolio with these kind of gyrations. It seems a little nuts to me, but risk on, risk off, wax on, wax off, right?
Yeah, well, in the Davos Conference that just concluded, one of the big stories was that the billionaires were saying that now it's time to not play the game anymore and just go to cash. And that kind of implies that the 1% is getting a little worried about its investments and is therefore getting conservative. And if that happens, then that's a lot of selling pressure on financial assets across the board because they're the main owners of financial assets. You know, we've reached a point where wealth is so stratified that a relative handful of people own most of the assets that we consider to be wealth now in the world. And if they decide to get conservative and start selling, then that is an awful lot of sell orders flooding into the market all of a sudden.
Yeah. And who else is left to buy it? I mean, we're out of greater fools, right?
Well, yeah, you're not going to see the average middle-class person in the U.S. buying a lot of stocks and bonds because they don't have the money to do it. You know, something like half of U.S. workers right now have less than $1,000 in the bank. And the average income now, the average wage in the U.S. is something like $30,000 a year. So you won't see buying bubbling up from the 99%. Because they've been basically stripped of most of their wealth in the last couple of decades of dominance by big commercial banks and central banks and ever-growing government. So until that reverses, for the investment markets, you've got to look to the super rich. And as they go, so goes the Dow Jones Industrial and Treasury bonds and gold and silver and London real estate and all the rest. You know, I quoted an article last week about how all of a sudden, high-end London real estate is finding air pockets under its prices because the buying pressure from overseas has suddenly dried up. So a lot of these, you know, townhouses in hot neighborhoods and condos in central London, things like that, that have just gone up like crazy in the last few years because Russians and Chinese were buying them for cash without regard for price, suddenly are headed back down. And the people who own them and are trying to get out now are finding no buyers. So they're cutting their prices from, you know, £3 million to £2.4 million to £1.9 million and still not finding buyers. So that's a sign that there has been a sea change in the attitudes of the guys with the kind of money that allow them to buy $3 or $4 or $5 million condos in London. And if that's going to be the case across the board, then that is a big change in demand for financial assets and for high-end real assets like trophy real estate and fine art, and that's going to drive the markets in general lower in the year ahead.
You think, huh? And, well, we also are seeing that currency controls are becoming quite in vogue in the U.S., particularly in Manhattan and in Miami. All condos, all real estate being purchased for $3 million or more for cash now have to get reported to the federal government. And if they're owned in a corporate entity, or a LLC or partnership, whatever, then the government is getting notification of the actual principals in the purchase. and that's got to hurt the foreign real estate market. They don't want their actions known to the general public, especially the Chinese. And so far, it's just in those two cities. But you can see it spreading to others. And supposedly what I read was it was at the behest of the Chinese that the Treasury Department handed down this basically this diktat.
Yeah. Well, capital controls can come in a lot of forms. And normally when a society starts to panic, the early form of capital controls is stepped up reporting requirements. In other words, the government wants to know what you're doing in ways that it didn't used to. And in the U.S., we have really tons of onerous reporting requirements, especially regarding offshore accounts for U.S. citizens. But now we're starting to pay more strict attention to money coming in. And the next stage after that is limitations on what can be done. For instance, China now is limiting the amount of dollars that can be withdrawn from Chinese banks because they're worried about capital flight, about taking money out of the country. And so they're starting to impose restrictions on ways of doing that. And of course, in most of Latin America, there are all kinds of capital restrictions now. And in the US, we're starting to pay most attention to money that's coming in because we're worried about the sources and where it's coming from and what it means for local markets. The next stage of that is going to be the war on cash, where it gets harder and harder to transact without using a bank account or plastic or some kind of a loan. Mm-hmm. And the goal is to increase the control of government over the financial system. Not that it already doesn't control the financial system in most ways, but it's going to get harder and harder to transact in cash going forward in the U.S. That's probably the next stage of this process. And the ultimate end game here is basically the end of free trade and free capital flows because governments, each in their own way, are mismanaging their economies and becoming more and more worried about the net result of their mismanagement, which is extreme financial instability. And they're putting laws and regulations in place to make it, or to give them more control when the time comes. The ultimate end of all this is martial law. Yeah. And they want to have the tools in place to be able to, for instance, to shut down the internet if they need to, and to track every single financial transaction if they need to, and use that to control people's behavior because they're all worried about money being sucked out of the country by people who have lost faith in the government. And right now, we're kind of the beneficiary of that in the U.S. because other countries are in worse shape. They've mismanaged their systems to an even greater extent. So you're seeing Chinese, Russian, Latin American, and to an extent, European money flow into the U.S. But we're a mess too. We're mismanaging the U.S. economy on a vast scale. And I think the guys who are doing it see some of the potential downsides to what they're doing and are putting plans in place to allow them to deal with those downsides when it comes. And they're coming. There's really no doubt that we're headed for some kind of a financial crisis that leads to really unstable, really unpredictable capital flows, among many other things, crashing asset prices and political turmoil. And the political turmoil you see in the U.S. playing out now in both major party primaries, where in the Republican primary, Donald Trump was seen as the worst case scenario for a long time by most Republicans because he was such an unknown quantity and frankly has a big mouth. And the assumption, I think, within the Republican insiders was that he'd have his day in the sun and then
he'd collapse. He would fade away, right?
Yeah. As the prospect of an actual President Trump got closer, voters would switch to a mainstream candidate like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, who they understand and who could be trusted to stay within the boundaries of what is considered politically possible and prudent in the U.S. In other words, to behave like an employee of Wall Street, as our past 4 or 5 presidents have done. And they can't trust Trump to do that. So they never expected him to get as far as he did. And now somebody even scarier has come along, Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, who is...
Trump's looking pretty good now, huh?
Yeah, he is actually making Donald Trump look reasonable. And that's a sign of how far out of control the political marketplace has become, because voters have totally lost faith in insiders' ability to actually do a good job of running the country. So they're willing now to tear up the system and start over. So the guys they respond to are the ones who basically would do that, or at least say they would do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's on the Republican side. So now you've got people talking about Trump as, well, maybe we can handle him if he runs and loses. That's not a big deal. Or if he gets elected, he'll at least consult with us, and he'll be pragmatic. In other words, they're rationalizing the possibility that Donald Trump actually wins. And on the Democrat side, now you've got Bernie Sanders, who is an avowed socialist, and actually, I think a good person. He's an honest guy who believes or says what he believes, which you have to admire in a politician, because frequently strongly held beliefs are unpopular, and there's always the pressure to moderate your views in order to get votes. And Ron Paul never did that. And that's why libertarians love that guy, because you could always be sure of what he was going to say on a given subject, because he was consistent in his beliefs, but he would tend to say it better than you could say it, so he was great to listen to. Well, for socialists, that's Bernie Sanders. He's an honest guy who sincerely believes that the government should basically run the economy from end to end. And a lot of Democrats actually believe that, but they don't say it out loud because it's not politically feasible. But suddenly it might be, because again, the electorate is so disgusted with the powers that be in the current system, which is basically owned by Wall Street, that now they've got an honest socialist running against Hillary Clinton, who gets her biggest single piece of campaign financing from the big Wall Street banks. And they're thinking, well, hell, maybe I want to vote my conscience this time. And they're voting for Bernie Sanders, So it's completely possible we could have a Donald Trump versus Bernie Sanders election this year.
It's not possible, because look, Trump, definitely he's a viable candidate, but the Democrats still remember a candidate from way back when. You remember him, George McGovern.
Yeah.
And this guy would just be George McGovern Redux. They would just be destroyed. I don't care how good the guy sounds on paper. Once he hits the trail, he's wacko. He looked. He's Larry David, but running for office. I mean, for the president.
But he's winning in Iowa and New Hampshire right now
against Hillary.
What I'm saying is that's a very big deal for somebody with Bernie Sanders' profile to take the first two primary states. And you're right that the Democrats might, quote unquote, come to their senses before the end of the process and pick the mainstream candidate. But the fact that somebody like Bernie Sanders is at this stage in the process winning in two important primary states is still a big deal. It's still a sign that the system is starting to spin out of control. And you're right that Marco Rubio might, in the end, win the Republican primary, because he's still in the running. And if people, do what they normally do, where they get over their flirtation in the Republican Party with the bomb throwing outsider and switch back to the mainstream candidate, he could still win. But that we're this far into the process.
Highly, highly unlikely.
Rubio?
Yeah. Any mainstream.
It does look unlikely now. It looks like Trump or Cruz,
Less likely by the day. And it's becoming more and more Trump, every day. I mean, he's run a masterful campaign, and that's what they never expected, is that his campaign would be so brilliant and grassroots. The only consolation that the powers that be have is, well, will those voters actually show up at the polls or at the caucuses, whatever? Well, if they're standing in below zero, sub-zero weather, waiting to be one of 30,000 or 20,000 to watch Trump in an auditorium, you don't think they're going to show up at the polling place? If they're true supporters?
New converts to a cause are more likely to vote than old-style mainstream voters who've been doing it forever and who've seen that the results aren't always what they hope for, The guys who come in to a party because somebody new comes along and activates parts of the electorate that previously weren't too excited about it, they have a really high turnout rate. And so based on that, you would expect Trump's voters to have a higher turnout rate than Jeb Bush's or Marco Rubio's,
Yes.
And so, yeah, you got to say that right now he actually has a pretty good shot. But that's a symptom of a dysfunctional political system. In other words, we've screwed up the economy to the point where people are willing to throw bombs because Trump is really an unknown quantity from the point of view of what would he do in office, because he's never been in office,
Mm-hmm.
And when guys like that, or Marine Le Pen in France, or the people who just took over in Spain end up being handed power, that's a sign that the economy is so messed up that the political system is basically being torn out by the roots and replaced. And that's a revolution. Revolutions tend to be very messy. They're not pleasant experiences most of the time. And that's really what we're headed for, which is really the thesis that you and I have been putting out there for a really long time, Kerry? That we're messing things up to the point that that the systems have become unpredictable and unstable.
Right.
And that from a financial standpoint, you don't want to be in mainstream normal assets. A typical portfolio of the last 70 years, stocks, bonds, and cash, they don't tend to do well during upheavals. And if we're heading into an upheaval, which all the political signs say that we are, and definitely all the economic signs say that we are, then you want to adjust your finances accordingly. And basically that means risk off in a big way. You go to real assets that governments can't screw up when they really start panicking. So extremely well-chosen real estate, international diversification, precious metals, those things tend to do well in times like this. And bank stocks and government bonds tend to do badly in times like this. So that's the kind of financial transition that you ought to be looking at probably if these scenarios play out the way they look like they're going to now.
Yeah. And it doesn't look like there's anything out there to stop them, does it?
Well, we borrowed so much money that it isn't clear that there's any painless way out of this, right? Mm-hmm. And if there's no painless way out, then that means we have a crisis of some kind, whether it's a 1930 style depression or a Weimar Germany style hyperinflation or some kind of some kind of command and control economy where capital controls are put in place and government tries to run things, something like that is coming. And there's no way to know exactly what it's going to be because this is such uncharted territory. We've never borrowed this much money and we've never leveraged the financial system beyond just plain debt. We've got all these kinds of debt that are out there that aren't defined as debt, but they're actually bigger than the officially reported debt. We've never done this before. So there's no way to know exactly how it plays out except to say that chaos will be the dominant theme of the next decade, probably.
I think you are correct about that. Chaos is definitely going to prevail, short of them all getting in a room and devaluing all the currencies against gold and getting a dose of fiscal sanity, which just ain't going to happen. Then we're going to go on to the next phase of the crisis, and that's the way that 2016 has started off. Anyway, find John's work at dollarcollapse.com. Sign up for John's new podcast. Just go to the iTunes store and type in Dollar Collapse and then click the subscribe button and you're there. And while you're at it, take a look at financialsurvivalnetwork.com. John, I just can't even believe how much interest in what you and I are doing here and so many others of you out there. The public is all of a sudden, they had like a giant wake-up call. The hangover from New Year's did not go away, and now you're out there looking for a cure. So you're coming to Dollar Collapse, you're coming to Financial Survival Network, looking, trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And hey, good for you. Just keep up your studies, get a lot of opinions, and keep going to our sites because you'll hopefully get the voice of reason. John, we will talk to you next week. What day is the podcast going to be done this week?
Probably Tuesday, Kerry. So
all right, Tuesday it is. It'll be up on Tuesday, so keep an eye out for it. But if you subscribe, it'll automatically come to you to your iTunes program, and you won't have to bother looking for it. So, and you could do it on your phone as well. Half of you out there listen to these things on your phone anyway. And hey, sign up for the newsletters on both our sites. John, we will talk to you next week.
Great. Thanks, Kerry.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.